Welcome to the Newton tutorial series. I'm Michael Cruz with AC-Tek, and this tutorial is going to be the first in a series of tutorials that discusses how to view and manipulate the results of your Newton simulation. More specifically, I'm going to be discussing the options in the display menu, the toolbar button, and the options in the right-click context menu. So the primary output from Newton is an uncompressed data file, a star.ucm file, and this can range in size from anywhere between 10 megabytes and 50 gigabytes, depending on the parameters of your simulation. So to open that file, you can go to Open, File, Open Playback File, or you can simply click on the green Open Playback File button on the main button bar. We'll select our file and open it up. Give it a second. And you can see in the corner it told us how many frames were in the file. So along the top we have some main rendering camera commands. There's the pan, orbit. What's nice about the orbit is if you hover along the top or the bottom, you can orbit the model only about the horizontal axis. Similarly, if you hover over on the right or the left side, you can orbit only about that vertical axis. And if you hover in a corner, you can orbit about the axis that points out of the page. And then we have the ability to zoom. You can also zoom using just the mouse wheel if you want. And then zoom window, where you can select a window to zoom in on. And I should also mention that in order to pan, you can either use the pan command, or you could simply hold Shift and click left and right, or click and move the mouse around. Click and move the mouse. Similarly to orbit, you can hold Control, and it will switch you right into orbit mode without having to click those buttons. Then next to those rendering buttons, we have some buttons for common view modes: top, bottom, left, right, isometric views, and whatnot. Next to that, we have the ability to save and recall up to 5 camera views. So if I had a custom camera view that I wanted to save or I wanted to go back to, I can go here and say set view 1, and I'll call it Goofy. Then if I'm at any other view, I can simply go here and recall Goofy, and it'll bring me right back to that view mode. You can also import and export these views so that you can share them between playback files, so you don't have to set up the same 5 views in multiple playback files. Next to those buttons, we have a set of buttons that do a few different things. The first one is the screenshot, which will take a screenshot of whatever is in this rendering window here. And the size of that screenshot, the dimensions, are based on the actual dimensions of the rendering window. So you can take and resize the rendering window before you take that screenshot. Or alternatively, if you go to the display menu, there are a few a few common rendering sizes that it will snap to, 1280 by 1024 or 1280 by 720. And then when you take your screenshot, it'll be exactly at that size. When you take the screenshot, you can select, well, do I want to save it as a PNG, a bitmap, a JPEG, or the TGA file type. Then next to the screenshot, we have a button for opening the Surface and Material Visualization window, or the SMV window. The SMV window is your primary window for manipulating the style of the layer, the style of the particles, your clip planes, and just viewing work and triangle forces as well. This SMV window will be discussed in a separate tutorial. Next to the SMV window, you can open up the AVI Creator window. And what that does is that will open up a window where you can add and save your keyframes and create an animation. That will also be discussed in a separate tutorial. Next to the AVI Creator window, there's a plotting window button, which opens up a window for plotting some results. This will plot tonnage, work, triangle forces, a few different things, and you can export those results also. We'll talk about that in a separate playback file. In a separate tutorial. And then next to these buttons, we have our main playback commands. There's play and stop. You can skip backward a frame, forward a frame, or you can go all the way back to the beginning, skip all the way to the end. Next to that, there's an option where you can quickly go to a different percent in the simulation. So I want to be 10, if I wanted to move 10% through the simulation, and then 20, and then 30, 100. And finally, at the end here, there's a nifty little feature that we've added recently, is a text box where you can just manually punch in the time that you want to go to. So if I wanted to go to 18.45, I can type 1845, just hit enter, and it'll bring me right there. I want to go to 29.99, done. So then, some of these options that are in the along the top button bar are also available in our right click menu. Our main pan, orbit, zoom window commands are there. The preset views are there as well. There's also an option to switch from orthogonal to perspective mode if you prefer to work in perspective mode. Also in the right click context menu, we have the option to change the orbit center of gravity. So by default, when we're orbiting, we're going to orbit about the center of gravity of all the layers combined. So that says, if you look at the location of our little rendering UCS, that's telling you the point that we're orbiting about. If I wanted to change that to the origin, I could simply say, well, let's go to the origin, and it'll shift that over, and now we're rotating about that origin. Or if I want to go only about the visible layers, I could hide some of these layers and then go here and say visible, and it would recalculate the center of gravity for that axis of rotation. The orbit sensitivity is simply the sensitivity, the speed at which you orbit when you move the mouse. It's just sometimes handy to be able to rotate the model just a tiny bit if you wanted to, if you're trying to line up a perfect view for a screenshot or whatnot. Beneath the orbit sensitivity, there's an option to open up a set of advanced orbit commands. Now these are really handy and pretty new as well. So let's say I was at a top view using my top view button, but maybe I didn't want this receiving belt to be moving horizontally. Maybe I wanted it to be going up and down vertically. Well, I could try to hover here and rotate this and get it exactly perpendicular, straight up and down. Or I could simply open up my advanced orbit commands and I say, well, from the current view, I want to rotate by 90 degrees about this axis coming out of the page. And it does that. Or I could say, hey, I want to rotate by 32 degrees the other way. Or I want to rotate by say, 15 degrees about this horizontal axis. And it'll rotate the model based on the current view of the camera. So it doesn't matter what the actual orientation of the model is. It just looks at our current view and says, relative to this current view, I'm going to rotate about the horizontal or the vertical or the axis coming out of the page. And when you take a screenshot, if you have this orbit command open, these buttons are not included in the screenshot. They're on top of the rendering window, so they wouldn't be cluttering up the frame if you create a screenshot or an animation. Show UCS icon just turns on that icon, which is displayed at the 000. Beneath that, we have a menu for some quick commands for manipulating the view of the surfaces. So if I wanted all my surfaces to be solid, I can quickly just go here, right-click Surfaces Solid. And it'll change all the surfaces to solid, and it will disable the outer lines. If I switch to transparent, it'll make all the surfaces transparent, and it will turn on those outer lines, those black lines that simply make it easier to see what you're looking at. If I go in here and I say toggle outer lines, it will turn them all off. Now you can see in the transparent mode it's a little bit more difficult to see the boundaries or the edges of each of the layers. So it's usually nice to have the outer lines enabled at the same time that you have the transparency enabled. Or I can switch to wireframe, which was that default setting, but obviously with wireframe we're seeing all these intermediate triangles that we don't really care about. We only care about the outer lines, the lines which show a change in the profile of the surface. And at the bottom here, there's an option to turn on triangle normal vectors, and that will simply render a magenta little vector at the center of each triangle, and it will point in the direction of the triangle's normal vector. And this is mostly used only in pre-processing. When you import a belt, you want to make sure that all those normal vectors are pointing up and inward toward the center of the belt. Beneath that surface menu, there's an option for some quick settings with the particles as well. So if I wanted to quickly hide the particles, I can do it there. Or if I wanted to disable the adaptive degradation. So when I'm rotating the model, you can see that the particles kind of change color. And if I zoom way in, you can see what's actually happening is we're simply rendering the particles as a set of 3 lines rather than spheres. Whenever I try to pan or orbit or zoom the model, it's simply changing the rendering mode so that it's much more responsive when you're trying to move the model around. And if you wanted to temporarily disable that, you can quickly do it just by saying disable degradation. And then any of these commands, it won't allow it to do that adaptive degradation, and it'll be a little bit more choppy when it's moving around. Then below that, there's some options to quickly color the particles by velocity, or quickly color them by cluster type, or you could color them by CPU thread. If we were running a simulation, that option would be enabled. Then below that, there's an option to quickly change the velocity scale. So if I wanted to go from 0 to 0.5 or from 0 to 8 meters per second, you click on that, and you notice we weren't in particle coloring mode, we weren't in velocity color mode, but by selecting that option, it switched us from cluster type to velocity color mode, which is pretty nice. And then finally, there's just an option to open up the SMV window, which is identical to the button along the top here. Going up to the display menu, there are the same screen capture, screenshot. There's the rendering window size, which will just quickly change the size of that rendering window for your screenshot. You can change the background color for the rendering window. There's an option to change the playback speed. So when I'm actually playing back, I can choose whether I want it to play back at as fast as it possibly can, which would be fast, or I can say, well, I would slow it down a little bit, or I can go slow if I want, which is I want to say 1 frame every 0.75 seconds. There's an option to turn on frame skipping, so you can skip every other frame, or skip 4 out of 5 frames, or 9 out of 10, to jump through the simulation a little bit faster. To turn that off, we simply go back in there and click on it again, and then you can see it's been disabled. There's the same controls, play, stop, go back a frame, forward frame, and the same as on the button bar here. Then there's the same surface menu and same particles menu that are in the right click menu. It's just the same thing, we've put it in the display as well. The orbit commands will turn on or off that same orbit commands that's in the right click menu. And then you can turn on or off that UCS, using the display menu as well. So I think that about covers the options, the main rendering and manipulation options that I wanted to cover for this tutorial. So the next one's going to talk about some of the features in this SMV window. So if you have any questions that weren't covered in any of these playback tutorials, then feel free to send us an email at info@actech.com. Thanks.